My name is Emma. I am here on behalf of Chevalier's books. We just want to thank you all for coming, for supporting the store, and also our lovely Kathleen. We're really excited. You can catch me after the event, and we'll get all your information to ship a book to you later this week. And just want to thank Judge Marc.
Marmaro.
Judge Marc.
That's fine. I'm retired. So
Just for this, letting us into your beautiful home, and we're really excited. Yeah, thank you.
So I hope I don't trip, but I was reminded of a trial I had in LA Superior 20 years ago when one of the jurors said to me, "You know, sweetheart, you did a great job, but stay away from the equipment. You're only going to hurt yourself." As I start trip. So first of all, thank everybody for coming. Let me introduce our author, Kathleen Tuttle, who is first and foremost a dear friend of Cheryl's and mine for many, many years. Kathleen is a native of Los Angeles. She went to the University of, to Berkeley Law School. I was going to say Bolt, but I know you. Berkeley Law School.
Yeah.
Berkeley Law School. She began her career on the East Coast. She worked in the public sector, both on the House and Senate side, then came out to Los Angeles in private practice. But she spent most of her career in the antitrust division of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, which was a very intensive job. She worked with, among others, Cheryl in the office. And she's been active in bar events. She is active in the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court Historical Society. She's a former president, a very recent former president of the Chancery Club, and I know there's some members here today. And she's an author with a very eclectic palette. This is her third book. She's written a book on Sylvanus Marston, who's a famous architect. She's written a book on the history of the Altadena Country Club. And now she's turned her attention to the lawyers of Los Angeles. So that is a tremendous breadth. So I have to start by just saying this book is many, many things. I have to tell you, I know many of you know Howard Miller. And Howard told me he believes that, and this may be a bit of an overstatement, that every lawyer should have a copy of this on his or her shelf. That's what he told me anyway, and there's nobody I really respect more than Howard. But this is a prodigious project. It's so many different things on so many different levels. It's a biography in which the lawyers are the stars, their careers, the industries they created and serviced. It's an encyclopedia. It's a history of Los Angeles, the issues that came up over the last, it's going to be 70 years, but more than 70 years. So it's legal history, it's everything. And I have to say, as I mentioned, she was writing this book. It took her about 4 years while she was a full-time practicing lawyer. She had a day job, and that makes it even more impressive. So I guess I'd like to, how did this come together?
No. You know, Marc, first, am I on? Can you hear? It seems different.
You hear?
Is it on?
Should be. Try it.
That's not.
He said, keep me away from the equipment.
Here.
Joe was right.
Got it. Don't worry.
Hello?
Okay.
Well, that's wrong.
Okay.
Let's try it again.
I don't think I'll have a problem.
Okay, perfect.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Marc, first. Huge appreciations.
Yeah, it's not on.
Do you want to switch and give her my mic?
No. Is that button on your mic?
There you go.
I really want to thank you and Cheryl for holding this event today. This I have to address right away. This is the first event, live event, that we have been able to do for the book, and the book came out a little over a year ago. So to be able to see real human faces and also people who are here today who helped me with certain chapters, who I had in some cases never met before, but spoke to them by phone. Frank Gruber, it's a thrill a minute. And so thank you, Marc and Cheryl, so much. And thanks to Bert Deixler.
Who would you like to get
Okay,
started
well, I
with?
don't know. I meant to leave this.
Stay away from the
Let
equipment.
me stay away from the equipment. Where's Cheryl? Can you?
Anyway, Bert Deixler and Chevalier's bookstore and his staff here today, there are throngs of them running around. How did the book come
Yeah,
to?
how did it come to? Well, first of all, a thank you to everybody for being here.
Yes,
This event
absolutely.
wouldn't be possible without all of you.
Mask or no mask? Oops, we're outside. It's all
We're
cool.
outside, but I bought 70 masks for everybody. You can take one with you. It's a party thing. Go ahead.
Well, Nolan Hahn, who was the head of the LA County Bar History Book Committee, called me in 2014 and said, you know, we're trying to put this book together, and I've heard that you've written a couple books, and I think that was, he heard it from Harry Hathaway, who's front and center here, and I will say more about you soon. You know, called Kathleen Tuttle. Yes, I've written 2 other books before this one, not on the law, but I love Southern California, or as I like to call it, Southland history. And he said, well, we're having a meeting in 2 weeks. Could you write a proposal of what you think the content should be and meet with us? And I thought, 2 weeks, well, okay. So I did, and we got together, and really that's when things started rolling after that. We just had to take care of 2 small little issues. One was getting LACBA, LA County Bar, to wrap itself around the concept. They had not put a book out on the LA Bar since 1959. So it's an organization that does many things, and we finally got that squared away. And then we had to raise the funds because the bar didn't have the money, and nor does it now, to put out something like this. And that's where Harry Hathaway enters the picture. He's a retired partner from Fulbright and Jaworski, and he shook the trees, and he twisted elbows, and he beat the pavement, and he really is why this book happened. So Harry, maybe you can turn around and take a bow, and we'll just applaud you. So great. So that was the first piece.
So one of the things that's notable about the book is you had interviews with a great many people, prominent lawyers, names that everybody here would recognize. How did you set them up? And I know we'd be here for 2 weeks if you told us about all of them. Are there some notable stories that you have?
Sure. And let me just back up for a second because I have a prop here. As to how I was able to put this whole thing together, there were interviews, as Marc says, and I'll get right to that quickly because we have a lot to cover. Also, the LA County Bar Journal, the Bar Bulletin, and lawyers here know what that's all about. It's gone through many different name changes. It began in 1925, and it's a monthly. I read all those issues. Pretty fascinating. I mean, I got to tell you, especially in the 20s and 30s. I curated the best of that material from the Bar Bulletin and put it in 3-ring binders, and it became 7 3-ring binders. So there was that, the LA Times, fabulous coverage of most of the issues in the book, and now we'll talk about the interviews. I missed my prop. I put the interviews and the LA County Bar information and LA Times information all together into this, and I call it my chronology. And it's 239 pages. And so I like to say there was a book before there was a book, and this is it. You can see yes, I used it.
Did you copyright the book before the book? Neville might have something to say about that.
Yeah, I'll talk to him after. People made this book. It's about people, and I think history is about people. I have been fighting with Marc for a week over, I want to say more. Let me say more. No. I will only
Judges give people time limits.
Yes, I will only mention three people for now that will give you a flavor. Judge Stephen Reinhardt of the Ninth Circuit. I interviewed him about 2 years before he died. I'm over there in his chambers. He, as many people here know, has had this huge long career. He was in his 80s when I interviewed him. He spent his entire adult life in LA as a lawyer and a judge. Tons of cases. The one thing that really stuck in his craw is the following story. Cynthia Holcomb Hall had been elevated to the Ninth Circuit in 1984. And she lost her husband about 4 years before. He was the member of the California Club, and she was then known, when he passed away, as the widow member. And so she still proceeded to try and hold the party there, but, and Reinhardt is telling me all these details, 1984. He said, the club, because she was just the widow member, required all guests to enter through a certain entrance and to use just certain bathrooms. And Reinhardt finally said, at least all the liberally minded judges boycotted it. They said, forget it. So it was a very different event that she had intended. And Reinhardt said that went on for a very long time. Of course, things are different now. But at the time, you know, it was...
And we'll get to it later, but that's one of the themes in your book, the inclusiveness, the increasing inclusiveness of the bench and the bar in Los Angeles. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but
yeah, it'll come back.
It'll come back. It'll come to Judge Reinhardt.
Sure. And then there's Marianna Felser, who had died a couple years before I could get to her, unfortunately. But I read a lot about her. She, and some people here know this, she was at the top of her class at UCLA, class of 1957. She says, I was turned down by a firm that hired the last man in the class. I don't think I'll ever get over that. She said, on further reflection, I ran around looking for ways to enter the profession, and I was roundly ignored. And then, even later in time, she really realized that she was trying to invade a male sanctuary, and that's why it was so uphill. My third example is Dick Reardon, our former mayor in LA. And this is an example of serendipity, which all authors, and really anyone in the arts at all, wants to have happen. Serendipity, things you didn't expect that were really cool things. In the summer of 2016, after the book contract was signed and everything was ready to go and I was plunging into work, I took a long weekend and went to the Ojai Inn. I brought about 8 oral histories with me, sort of like a busman's vacation, but you know, I was thrilled and I was getting into the book. And the second morning I headed out to breakfast and took an oral history with me. You can't have breakfast, you can't have a meal without reading an oral history. And I ran right in to Dick Reardon. He was with his son-in-law, they were out there buying property, and Harry knows this, he was one of our very first contributors financially to the book, and was very enthused about it, and so I was just effusive with him. Oh, you know, thank you so much, and blah, 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 and I said, oh, I'm the author. I'm now writing the book. He said, let's all go to brunch. So we sat down, and he was, I was writing profusely, and he was talking a mile a minute. It was fun for these people. I mean, it seemed like it, one after another. And there were 2 takeaways. First, he recalled the time when he began as a young lawyer on Spring Street at O'Melveny. That's where the firm was then. It was in the late 50s. And he said, you know, we only had to have 1,300 billables. And now I'm going to pause for...
Was that for the whole year, or was that the first half of the year?
Yeah, major laughter. It's just amazing. And, but then he said he spoke about a lot of different lawyers, and he said, Walter Nossaman. And I thought, okay. And he actually left O'Melveny, went to Nossaman's firm, and was there for a period of time. And Nossaman would have been a generation ahead of Dick, and Dick really, really looked up to him. And I thought, well, I'm going to pay attention to that. I wrote down Nossaman. And you'll see Nossaman in the book, here, there, and everywhere, because I was really impressed with him too. So that was a lot of fun.
So, I got to ask you, the book is 1950 to 2020, and the structure changed because you start earlier. There are a couple of things I want to ask you about, but the first thing is the why.
Yeah.
Having set out to write a book starting in 1950, why did you go back? And as far as really the Spanish and Mexican era, but
I
just the
appreciate
why.
you noticing. It surprised me too. We were going to start at 1950, but the book that came out before, By the Bar, in 1959, with the same name, Lawyers of Los Angeles, was supposed to cover the beginning of LA as a village and then a small city up to 1950. But the more I and Harry and other people kind of focused on it, we realized it didn't talk about Brown versus Board of Education, and it came out in 59, the book. It did not talk about the House Un-American Activities, and there was a lot of that stuff going on in LA. HUAC came here to Los Angeles 3 or 4 times. And then I discovered in my overall research for the book, there were a couple of cases that were, nowhere to be found. And we've talked about the Mendez case.
Mendez versus Westminster School District, and you mentioned Brown versus the Board of Education not being, and that was an eye-opener to me. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on how many are like me who had never heard of the Mendez case out of the federal district court here. But Kathleen, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, it was a surprise to me too. It was a 1945 lawsuit against 4 Orange County school districts who logistics.
It's equipment.
Yeah. The lawyer involved was David C. Marcus, who was a law grad from USC in the class of 27. And he actually handled a lot of public interest-y kinds of cases, and I'd love to know more about him. He's long since gone. He filed the lawsuit to allege that the school districts were forcing, really siphoning off children of Mexican descent to what they called Mexican schools. I'd never heard this before. And if you Google this, you will find pictures of Mexican children, only Mexican kids, in what looks like really crappy classrooms and, very insufficient. And so this lawyer was representing 4 Mexican-American fathers whose students were stuck in those schools. And it was a 2-week trial in downtown Los Angeles in federal district court, and that was the only district court in Southern California. There was no district court in San Diego, so this was really it. And after a 2-week trial, and the judge allowing social science evidence, like the Brandeis brief that we became familiar with in law school, social science evidence like the mistreatment of children, the siphoning them off in special classes because of their race, how it might engender feelings of inferiority later, all that kind of thing. Federal Judge Paul McCormick ruled that this was segregation and it was unconstitutional, and it was the first decision by a federal court anywhere in the country to assert separate but equal is unconstitutional. It went up on appeal, and people on both sides of the issue were very anxious about it, and you can imagine why. There was a lot at stake. Many amicus briefs were submitted, one by Thurgood Marshall and Lauren Miller, who was a very famous black lawyer in Los Angeles, died many years ago now. They submitted their amicus brief on behalf of the NAACP. Well, the Ninth Circuit affirmed 8 years later, and this is what I think Marc and I find so admirable and fascinating. When Brown versus Board was decided, and many scholars have written this now, Earl Warren read and thoroughly absorbed McCormick's district court ruling prior to issuing Brown. So Mendez was the precursor, and we can be proud of that.
That's something I didn't even know until I read this book.
Yeah.
Kevin, I'd like to move
Sure.
along.
Yeah.
I'm going to get us to past 1950, but we are here in Los Feliz. And right down the street at Edgemont and Los Feliz was the home of a man named C.C. Julian, who was one of the earliest fraudsters in Los Angeles, a huge $100+ million fraud. Can you give us the thumbnail sketch of that?
I know it's been very hard to get to the thumbnail on this one. I will try. Maybe I'll talk fast. That's what we'll do.
Not talking.
Okay. C.C. Courtney Chauncey Julian was his name. He was from Canada. He had oil field experience in Texas and then Bakersfield. He sauntered into LA in 1921. He started out in overalls and was in the fields. As beginner's luck would have it, he hit a gusher, a 10-acre oil field in Santa Fe Springs. He had other drilling victories to be sure, but what he learned early on, as the prince of oil promoters, as he was called, to get wealthy, you do so not by pumping oil, but by promoting it. And so that's what he did. How did this all happen? Let me take you back in time for a very few minutes and be with me where we're going. It was the dawn of the advertising industry. Truth in advertising had no place. No one ever heard the phrase. CC flooded the newspapers, and there were 7 dailies in LA, hard to imagine, with homespun phrases. Just an ordinary, everyday guy who worked in the fields for every dollar he earned. Let me be your Santa Claus this New Year's Eve. That's a good one. Imagine this. There were tours of the oil fields. The streets bordering Pershing Square, where we've all been. They were jammed every day with touring buses ready to take the throngs out to the oil fields. 50 bus companies were engaged in that work. There were posters, handouts, solicitations flooded the mails. Hucksters roamed among the crowds in downtown, pitching, get rich quick, see the gushers in Santa Fe Springs. In less than a year, CC made several million, a lot of money back then. That's a lot of money now. Suddenly, he was a rich man living in Los Feliz.
Right down the street.
Yeah, on a 4.5 acre estate. And Natty Dresser drove a Pierce Arrow, the works. It turns out the stock was watered, the books were cooked, thousands of victims were penniless. A lot of them were recent retirees from the Midwest. As investigations tightened around CC, he sold the company to Sheridan Lewis, remember that name. In the end, the fraud exceeded $150 million and some 40,000 people were fleeced.
How did law enforcement do in all this?
Yeah, that's they were...
We would have loved this case in the Southern District of New York.
It was pretty pathetic. In 1928, DA Asa Keyes, K-E-Y-E-S, launched a prosecution against the Julian Company, Lewis, and Associates. C.C. Julian was sort of out of the picture by now. It was then the longest trial in the county, 4.5 months. 99 volumes of transcripts later, they were all acquitted. The jury said they were confused by the testimony. Well, Keyes himself threw in a couple of hours of testimony in the people's closing, and everyone found it, the word was baffling.
Keyes is the DA.
This is the DA. And he contradicted his subordinates. That's not good, Mark.
Not good.
No, it doesn't help at all.
Clarity of message is what you want.
Yeah. Now, I wonder why Keyes was like that. 6 months later, big news. 3 jurors took bribes. DA Keyes accepted a bribe and threw the case. Now the new DA, Buron Fitz, saw to it that Lewis, the ex-DA, and half a dozen others were tried, convicted, and went to prison. An elected DA went to prison. It doesn't happen all that often.
What happened to Julian?
You know,
He goes to jail?
he...
No, he's acquitted.
It was... No, he wasn't part of that, but he decamped to Shanghai, where he killed himself in his hotel room after a champagne meal and then a vial of poison. Truth is better than fiction. I can't believe all these facts. It's really fun to talk about. And if I can say one
Well,
thing.
I have to say, I found it fascinating, in part because I know he lived here, so I sort of insisted that Kathleen work this in, even though it's before 1950.
Yes, that's right. There you go. I found a comment online, and this is before my computer completely died yesterday. Talk about timing. A phrase from the 20s that well describes the scandal's devastating impact. Ordinary people had their financial eye teeth extracted without gas or Novocaine and walked around with bloody gums. That's what it did to people.
Well, maybe that's a segue to our next session. I want to talk about the legal profession, because we've seen a lot of change, and the book talks about this. Some of us remember hearing about, and a couple of us remember living a kinder and gentler profession, which is what you call it at one place. Another place, you call it insular, conservative, and conformist. And that was the 50s and the 60s, and I wasn't practicing but when I started in the early 70s at a big firm, it was kind of like that. And I know one of my classmates is here, and my guess is his Ward's experience of the McCutcheon firm was probably pretty similar in those days. The partners all wore hats, they were all men.
Yeah.
So how did things evolve and change?
Yeah. It's fun to talk about periods of time that are closer to us because it's part of our lived experience. JFK gave his unforgettable address at the Democratic Convention in downtown Los Angeles in 1960. And it was watershed. He said, we can do better. It's time for a new generation. The old ways won't do. And we think that's kind of fluff today, but they were real words then. And society, people in charge were all white, and minorities, women, they got a lot of hope from those words. The whole country did. Suddenly progressive judicial appointments were made by especially Governor Pat Brown. And the judiciary was white until these changes began to happen, and people took notice. The black population in Los Angeles spiked, and they elect Tom Bradley and Billy Mills. Greater power, more voice, demands for inclusion. The well-ordered serenity that the words Marc uses gave way to new realities, and especially here in California, that woke people up. There was attention like never before to racial inequities. And I know even if some of you weren't raised in Los Angeles, you know about the Watts riots in 1965, but there was another important development that is less recognized. It's the fair housing controversy, where the Rumford Fair Housing Law that the legislature, it was signed into law in 1963. It was repealed when Californians went to the polls and voted in general election 1964 for Proposition 14, which was the repealer of the fair housing law. And then the first lawsuit came along and tested Proposition 14's constitutionality, and it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in 1967 by a 5-4 vote that Prop 14 was unconstitutional. So fair housing really did prevail, but there were a lot of scars after that time. It was very fractious. I'm just curious, how many remember that fair housing fight? Yeah, I do. I was young, but I remember. All the churches held meetings, the whole thing. And another thing happened to law firms, which was even more directed certainly at them. The New York law firms invaded Los Angeles starting in the mid-70s.
They wouldn't call it an invasion.
And it endured all the way through the 1980s. There was consolidation. To stay competitive, some very good firms, I always mention Kathleen Felser, went down the tubes. No more sloughing off for senior partners, you got to get back to work. And law became more a business, and less a profession, and that never really changed. And, that is regrettable. So.
But during this period, and obviously some other law firms started during this period, a couple of the founding partners of my former firm, Bruce Stefan and Bob Mangels, are here today. But during this period, in the 70s in particular, women, minorities began to appear in increasing numbers in other law firms. What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, I like to start it this way. It's true that in the mid-1960s, at the Spring Street firm of Shepard Mullen, for instance, and I don't mean to pick on them, there were many firms just like them. I just happened to get this really great quote from one of their partners who joined the firm in 1964 or 5. He said, "They were still all white shoe lawyers, coats worn in the hallways, boaters in the summer." They're your hats. And yet, change was afoot. In 1965, Beardsley Hofstadter was the first downtown firm to hire a black lawyer, and some of you may know his name, Sam Williams. That challenged other firms. Firms began to think. Well, to help the thinking of these law firms were two national law magazines that began in the 1970s, and they gave higher ratings to firms with diversity. So, and I should say frankly, there was increasing diversity in the pipeline. I see Aviva Bob here, who went to UC Berkeley Law School, as did I. You were a little bit ahead of me. I don't know how many women were in your class, but in mine, I started in 75, 30%. Yeah, so things really started to change. And remember, too, that women and minority lawyers were beginning to receive appointments to the federal bench. Shirley Hofstadter went to the Ninth Circuit, 1968. In the 1970s, things really changed. Marianna Felser, Cecil Poole, Terry Hatter, and many more that I could mention all went to the federal bench in California. So the face of the bench really changed.
And that's obviously been one of the major themes of your books. Things did change over the years, and it's a much different bar today in 2021. I want to shift gears, if I can. Your book proceeds chronologically for much of it, until we hit chapter 5, in which you deal with what I consider to be LA's signature industry, the entertainment industry. And you then go back in time, as well as, you go back in time and you talk about the development of the entertainment industry and the bar. Can you talk about that?
Well, this chapter 5 on entertainment law, made in Los Angeles, entertainment lawyers and their world. This became my favorite chapter. My research was like going to school. I learned about this whole new world. And unlike other chapters, I did not start in the 1950s and go forward. The spark for starting this chapter in the early 1900s was that new material became available. A binder stuffed with fabulous interviews of the Loeb firm was brought to my attention. It was prepared by the firm in 2003, and I think they always intended to put a book out, but it never happened. So, and it's largely unavailable. I think there are a couple copies floating around Los Angeles, so you got to get the book. It's really essential to get this story. And I only had a chance to really dig into the binder and read it on the eve of writing the chapter on entertainment. It blew me away. It changed everything. I thought, we got to go back to the early 1900s. Loeb started in 1909, and these interviews consisted of freestyle, unfiltered discourse between their senior-most partners who not only knew the Lobes, they practiced with them. It's just too good. So it was irresistible to journey back to entertainment law's starting point. And I would do that, and it makes sense that it would be this legal specialty. After all, entertainment is what Los Angeles uniquely does. It's our premier homegrown industry.
Yeah, I think just like the securities industry is New York's industry, entertainment industry is our industry.
Yeah, that's
But you went back in time. Can you talk about what I think you call the founding generation?
yes. The first firm in 1908 was Mitchell, Silverberg, and Knupp, MS&K. It was said, Hollywood and Silverberg, Mendel Silverberg, he was that firm. Hollywood and Silverberg made a perfect match. It had visibility and money. He had prestige and power. He was MGM's lawyer, and on and on and on. Eddie Rubin. I've got to make a comment. In fact, some people talked about Eddie Rubin here. He's since deceased. He headed MS&K's entertainment practice. He went from Detroit and a dad on the Ford assembly line to legal greatness in LA, and he also happened to be a very nice man, apparently. Loeb was next, 1909. I could say more there, but it's in the book. And some great phrases about the Loebs. Eddie Loeb, as he liked to be called, played gin rummy every Saturday morning with Sam Goldwyn. That's how stuff got done. Kaplan, Livingston, Goodwin, and Berkowitz was next, 1932. And now Frank Gruber. Gentleman over here, raise your hand. I didn't know Frank from, nothing. And I was in the middle of the entertainment law section, and I read his name, someone who wrote this great article, and it's he who said that Kaplan Livingston was possibly the largest amalgamation of entertainment lawyers ever assembled. And I just love that you had all this expertise, and thank you for coming today. All right, Gang Tire and Greg Boutzer's firm would be the next two of the founders. And I have to end, if I can, the entertainment section by thanking Bert Deixler, because after I had just slaved over Chapter 5, I knew Bert just slightly, and I knew he did entertainment law, and I asked him at a party once, I scrunched up the entertainment law chapter, and I said, would you do me a big favor, would you read this draft and get back to me? He said, I will, and he did, and he was tremendously helpful. And I have to say this, he said, I'm really glad you put Mickey Reardon in the book. Rubin had been a lawyer at the Gang Tire firm and then went off on his own. He said, everybody has a Mickey Reardon story. And I have yet to hear a story, and I hope we hear it tonight.
So you mentioned the Gang Tire firm, and I think you quote one of the Loeb partners as calling it the gilt-edged entertainment law firm. And it's one of the oldest firms. Can you say a word about that firm, their practice, some of the lawyers?
And I want to, whoops, where am I? I want to say that Marc did a lot of work for the Gang Tire firm, and that says a lot about you. And that's all he would let me say, but it's true. Martin Gang.
For their clients, not for the firm.
Yeah. Formidable litigator. He handled Olivia de Havilland's lawsuit in 1944 against Warner Brothers, succeeding in ending the studio's infamous 7-year contract, which by now we've all heard about. It was Hollywood's version of indentured servitude. Until 1944, no lawyer and no actor would have dared take it on, and they did it. Gang defended scores of Hollywood talent and stars before the House Un-American Committee. There's a great deal about this in the book, and I will just encourage you to read it. There were sort of two views, a division of opinion on some of how Gang handled some of those cases, but one thing for sure is that everyone thought Gang was brilliant. There was no doubt about that. He graduated from UC Berkeley School of Law. Yay. In Bolt's, then it was Bolt Hall, and in 1927 was his year, and it's viewed as their vintage class. It included Bernie Whitkin, Herman Selvin, and Roger Traynor, who was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. I know, it's amazing. Yeah, and other people, other names you recognize. So moving right along, Bruce Raymer is the Princeton Harvard Law educated, now lawyer, now the senior most partner at the gang firm. He started there in 1963, and he became its 6th partner. And I was lucky enough to get an interview with him, and he's a brilliant and very gracious gentleman. He told me that upon once meeting Bernie Whitkin, Raymer said, "You know, I'm pleased to meet you. I know that you were in Martin's class at Bolt." Whitkin quickly replied, "No one was in Martin's class." Okay, can I say something about Hermione?
Go ahead, of course.
Yeah, Hermione.
Of course.
Hermione Brown.
Wonderful woman.
Yeah, she went to Wellesley, then was #1 in her class at USC in 1947. The day of her after her graduation, she went right over to the gang firm and began work. And she worked there steadily until 2003, which is 55 years. And she was someone to be reckoned with. She did their probate work. Her attorney's son, Harold Brown, who's a partner at gang now, the son recalled, "She wasted no time. She would take a pile of the latest appellate cases, a foot tall, and would read them while sitting under the beauty parlor dryer with a helmet of fire on her head." Hermione Brown. And here I have to say, in entertainment law, as with really many other areas of the law, the smaller boutique entertainment law firms were and are of great importance to balance the scales on representation in lawsuits and deals. And Neville Johnson is someone who's here today. There you are. At Johnson & Johnson, Beverly Hills firm. He was kind enough to give me an interview too. He frequently represents the talent side in lawsuits, where many have been shortchanged millions of dollars in profit participation deals. And here's a sentence that people will be familiar with. It was just said by someone in the Daily Journal about a week ago. "Hollywood is an industry that's been engaged for 100 years in denying the writer his due, but nothing starts without the word on paper." And Neville is not only an accomplished lawyer, but a serious guitarist and published author, and he certainly believes in that phrase, in the sentence I just read.
So the same can be true about music, musical composition.
Sure.
People create them. So, I want to conclude this section, but how can we not say a word about Greg Bouncer?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll start if you want. He was way before my time, and I think pretty much before Marc's time. There's a book out about him. My book says quite a bit about him. He was in a class of his own. It makes for great reading. I think it's unlikely we'll see someone like him again. Dating clients, legal ethics. Yeah. He got into fist fights at,
nightclubs.
I'm thinking, who were the fancy restaurants? And he was kind of the movie star in his own movie, in a way. So, what do you think?
Well, I think that his biography, The Man Who Seduced Hollywood, kind of says it all. I mean, what lawyer dates Joan Crawford, Lana Turner? The first thing he does upon graduation is spending all the money he could borrow on his clothing. And,
And he looked good.
And Kathleen said, "Did you know him?" I said, "Look, I was practicing when he was practicing. I was a lawyer in my 30s when he passed away. So I knew him kind of as an unapproachable, the senior partner of a big firm, the Lyman Bouncer firm. So I didn't really know him. I knew his name. I probably met him once or twice. But then at the Chancery Club in Harry, you may remember this, Angeles.
Yeah.
And then you were there, Kathleen, too.
That was a great
The
lecture.
author of the book about Greg Bowser gave the presentation, and that's what really opened my eyes about it. Fascinating story, but we had to at least mention him.
Yeah. Well, and Wyman Bowser was a very successful firm for a long time, and Frank Rothman was there, and boy.
Frank Rothman, Marianna Felser, Patty Glazier,
Yeah.
Chris Snyder, Judge Snyder, a lot of alumni from that law firm.
Yeah, so,
So
where are we?
Here's where I think we are. Can
Sure.
I ask you to talk about the hard, you've written about architecture. So I want to talk about the hardscape of Los Angeles, what you call the upbuilding of Los Angeles, by the role that lawyers played in that.
Well, the chapter on the 1960s discusses this at length, and I was really, it became, I had a lot of pride writing it. Lawyers had so much to do with the upbuilding of Los Angeles in the 1960s. The Music Center benefited from practically every department at the O'Melveny and Myers firm. The firm was preoccupied with it. They were hired by the county, whatever powers that be, and they really made it happen. And lawyers, of course, also were very significant financial contributors to anything important in the upbuilding of Los Angeles. But they were also just so incredibly civic-minded. And the Music Center is an example. Another example would be LACMA, that came to be the year after the Music Center. O'Melveny's Maynard Toll and John O'Melveny, Herbert Sturdy at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, Oscar Trippett at his own firm. A bit later, O'Melveny's Richard Sherwood would lead the museum's board in the next decade. I mean, these contributions were extensive and essential, and like Harry Hathaway, twisting the arms to find the money for this book, all of these people made these big, literally upbuilding LA. And
they were lawyers.
And they were lawyers. And now I should have started, you're mentioning a building, made me get right onto the Music Center in LACMA, but Paul Ziffren, huge figure in Los Angeles, fabulous lawyer. But his first claim to fame was being solely responsible for bringing the Democratic Convention in 1960 to Los Angeles.
Roz Wyman might have had a role there too.
Yeah. And she'll be happy to tell you.
I'm sure she will. I've never said that.
It was his idea. It put LA on the map. We were a small-ish kind of city then, and that was one of the first sort of times that LA really got national exposure. I suppose they did in the '32 Olympics, but in a different sort of way. And Ziffren went on to work at a couple of different firms and have his own firm, and just a very bright man and a real personality that made things happen.
So we have a couple of minutes left. You never want to be the person that's between everybody and food and drink, so I don't want to be that person. The book jacket talks about untold stories. Can you spend a couple of minutes on an untold you never knew until you wrote the book?
Boy, and it's
just maybe one.
Sure. It's I was learning it as I was writing about it. It has to do with undoing the color line in the LA Bar Association, which was the first name of the bar. The word county was added in 1960 to become LA County Bar Association. The bar took 2 or 3 votes in the 1940s on whether to admit attorneys of color, and they all failed. And the why was revealed when I read Herman Selvon's Oral History, which was done in 1978. And, you know, there isn't a huge audience for oral histories, so I'm kind of thinking that my inclusion of this story in the book is going to add something to the story, because in the first volume of Lawyers of Los Angeles, it just talks about those 2 or 3 votes in the late 40s, and you know, well, and then it did say that in 1950 they had a final vote and turned it around, and but you didn't know why, the why of it, and this is the purpose of the oral history. The red, which was the name given to lawyers who were either communist or had communist sympathies or were very leftist, and there were lawyers in Los Angeles in each of those 3 categories. The Red Hots always took the lead when it came to trying to eliminate discrimination, and made it their proposal. And now I'm really quoting the words of Herman Selvon, given the temper of those times, it scared off the supporters who feared affiliating with these very liberal or leftist lawyers. So the motion, or whatever it was, the vote always went down in flames. So Herman Selvon was vice president of the bar at this time. Dana Latham and Watkins was president. They put their heads together. They said, look, we got to change this. They had to outsmart the Red Hots. So they made it a bar proposal, and they called for a vote so fast that the Red Hots had no time to organize, and it resulted in a positive vote for change that everyone of every race is welcome. The Red Hots meant well, but they were self-defeating as to this particular issue. And so it's interesting.
Kathleen, you mentioned oral histories, and you reminded me of something that we haven't talked about, but a number of years ago, the Ninth Circuit Historical Society did a wonderful oral history with Hermine Brown, and she talked about her life and her career as a lawyer.
I cited.
Oh, did you?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Oh, no, and the Ninth Circuit Historical Society, they put out great paper, and they're a really active organization. They've had a few Zoom programs on various things. Very, very good. Yeah, they really got into her.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for number one, for writing this book, and Emma from Chevalier is here, and she'll be able to tell anybody how they can order it.
Oh, yes, yes.
So,
right, how to order the book.
Well, that's okay. She'll be. Emma, you can have a word. Where should people see you or something?
Hi, yeah, I'll be right in the back
Okay.
over at that table. You can just come down, give me your name, your number, and address, and we'll ship a book out to you this week. And
So-
I'll take your payment over there.
Thank you so much, everybody.
And I want to thank Marc again so much for working on this, and Cheryl for opening up your home. Thank you, everyone, for coming.